Hi, I'm Angie and this is DIY Homesteading from Missouri River Regional Library. Today we're going to make sourdough bread. So I have been making sourdough bread for just a month. I am not an expert, and in fact I am not sure I would even say I'm a very good beginner, but I have enjoyed the process of it. It is a very long process. I got my start, I took a class and with Rebecca Wilson, I believe her name is, with Cultured Cantina. And she provided my starter and gave us lessons on how to stir up the bread. And I've been practicing ever since. Sometimes failing, sometimes doing okay. But what we're going to do today is stir up a loaf of bread, and hopefully at the end of this whole process, you will have an edible loaf of bread. So what you need to start with is your starter. Now, you can make your own starter if you want, or you can get it from somebody. If you need a starter and you live near Jefferson City, you can contact me and I'd be happy to provide some starter. So to start with, I'm gonna put gloves on because sourdough is very sticky, and it will just stay on your hands until it becomes dough. So it's a very sticky bread. And then we're going to start with 3/4 cup of starter. So that's our starter we've had cooking, and we're going to put that in our bowl. So 3/4 cup of starter. Get it all out of there. It is starter is very interesting. I've never made a bread dough like this before, and it's a fascinating process, I will tell you. And then we have 2 tablespoons of olive oil. We're going to put that in there too. And then we have a cup of warm water. We're going to give that a little stir here. And then we are going to put in 4 cups of flour. So this is 4 cups of flour. Now, there is some talk about what kind of flour you use with sourdough. There's differing opinions. Rebecca at Cultured Cantina said that she prefers a nice bread flour. Some people prefer a mix of bread and regular flour. I am just using regular flour, and this could contribute to why I'm not 100% successful at this. But I found recipes that use regular flour, and I don't have bread flour, so I've just been using regular flour. So we're going to mix this up, and it looks very dry right now. It's not coming together, but that's okay because we're going to mess with it until it is a nice doughy consistency. You can use a stand mixer and your bread dough hook if you would like. I have done that in the past. It is wonderful because you will see this process is going to take us several minutes, and in the stand mixer it's like magic. That thing is amazing. It only takes just a couple minutes before this is all bread doughy looking. So we're just trying to get all of the dry ingredients, the flour, mixed into our wet starter and our water, and activate the glutens and get all that stuff. So, like I said, it's not a pretty dough yet, but it will be. And if you need to add just a little bit more water, you can. If you think, oh, this is never going to come together, it's just a dry dough, add just another little tablespoon or so of water. Let's see, just a little bit of drops. And that'll make it come together just a bit quicker. Otherwise, you're just going to have to knead it a little bit more. And you can switch off hands. This is really good exercise for your muscles. You can work your arm muscles and get this to come together. We're getting close here. So, like I said, I've been doing this for about a month every weekend because sourdough is, well, I mean, bread making is not a fast process. If you've ever made bread, you know you have to let it prove and rise, and then you bake it. So it's not something you can instantly make. But sourdough takes even longer. So once we get this into a bread-like consistency, we're gonna let it prove for 12 hours. And we're gonna set it in the refrigerator overnight. And then we're gonna bake it tomorrow. So you could do it all in one day. I think if you let it prove the 12 hours, you could bake it. But the way I was taught was not to do that, to put it in the refrigerator. And I'll pull this out of the bowl so it's easier to knead. And get it going that way. But I've had some successful breads. My very first one was pretty good. I actually tried making like a more French bread loaf where I cut it in two and made long skinny loaves. That worked okay. Wasn't bad. The last one I did was horrible. So if yours fails miserably, know that mine has too. And there's nothing wrong with that. It can happen. I think the problem I have had is that my bread dough has stuck to my bowls. So even though I flour the bowls that I'm proving it in, I still have a problem with my bread sticking. And that means that when it sticks, it comes out and deflates. So all that lovely air you've put in it to make it a nice big loaf of bread is now gone. And it's sad. I had the most gorgeous loaf you've ever seen that was proving, and it stuck to the bowl. And then it just deflated. It was horribly sad, I have to admit. So here's my ball of dough. Looks pretty good. Looks like bread dough now, doesn't it? We are going to let this sit for just a little bit to get, it activates the glutens. I can't remember the technical name for that, but activates the glutens, and we're gonna let that sit, and then we're gonna put some salt on it. So one of the things that I am hopeful will solve my sticking problems is I bought a proving basket. It's a Bannetan proving basket. Basically means it's a woven wood bowl that is made specifically for proving bread in it. And we're gonna try this. I tried it the other day and I hadn't seasoned my bowl correctly. So one thing I learned from the internet was that, like a cast iron pan, a Bannetan wood bowl needs to be seasoned before you use it. So you have to get it wet, let the wood absorb some water, and then you flour it so that all the little ridges are covered in flour, and then hopefully your bread won't stick to this. The other thing I learned that may help me is that I think I'm an impatient person, and so I would get this out of the proving drawer and it'd be beautiful, and I'd be like, it's time to bake it, and I'd flip it over and it would stick and then it would deflate. So what I learned is that if you let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes, it deflates just a little bit, just enough to break away from the bowl, and then you can just turn it over and it plops right out. And that is what you want to do, not have this sad, deflated loaf of bread like I had the other day. It was really sad. So I'm gonna put this in here to pour salt on it. So I have a teaspoon and a half of sea salt, and I just happen to have pink Himalayan sea salt. We just didn't have regular sea salt. It works just fine. And you want to sprinkle it over your loaf so that you can knead it all into there. So then we're going to just knead this some more and get the salt all incorporated. So I learned some things about sourdough when I was preparing for this. I learned that sourdough is one of the oldest forms of bread. Now, of course, unleavened bread is the oldest, you know, where they didn't have yeast. But sourdough was used by like pioneers and gold miners in the 1800s, and they would have a little pouch with their yeast starter that they would keep, and then they would make up their bread and carry their or let their bread proof as they're working during the day or overnight, and then they would bake it either in the morning or at night for dinner or breakfast, whichever one they preferred. But I thought that was interesting to think about gold miners going out and searching for gold and have a little packet with some yeast starter on their belt. Just thought that was kind of funny. There has been sourdoughs in the Middle East from, centuries ago. And, every culture has a bread culture, and sourdough just happens to be one of them. It's kind of been adopted by California, the sourdough culture of California. And that was due to the miners who came out there and settled with their sourdough. Okay, so here's my nice salty loaf of bread. I am going to put that in my proving basket, which I have floured. So it's got a nice dusting of flour. And I am going to let this sit for a little while. When I took my class, she said that the first 4 hours, you should get it out and knead it once an hour. And I've done that, and it works pretty good. We don't always have time for that, truth, right? But it will help make the gluten more stretchy and just make it a better loaf of bread. If you don't have time for that, just let this prove. You can let it prove in a warm spot. If you have a proving drawer on your oven, that works great. That's what I'm going to use. Our oven has a proving feature. Finding that out was a game changer. Let me tell you, that is amazing. You just hit this button, goes to the correct temperature, you leave it in there. We are going to cover this. You can either cover it with a dishcloth or saran wrap or something, but you don't want your bread to dry out, so you do want it covered up. And then we'll check on it in a few hours to see if it is raised into a nice, lovely loaf. So while we're doing that, we're going to talk about starter. Let's talk starter. So like I said, I got my starter from somebody, which is a legitimate way to do it. But you can also make your own starter. There are tons of recipes out there for starters. But the basic recipe is yeast, flour, and water, and a little salt or sugar. So like this recipe here says you put 2 cups of flour, 3 tablespoons of sugar, 1 package of yeast, half a teaspoon of salt, and 2 cups of warm water in a bowl. Stir it up, let it sit for 2 to 3 days, and then you have a starter. Now, the fun thing about your starter is that you have to feed it. It's a living organism, and it will grow. You can see I have mine in a jar, a very messy jar, and on a pie plate, because I fed this last night and knowing that I was going to use a bunch of it today for my recipe, and it grew and it went over top my jar and it was a mess. You want it to be able to breathe and to come out, so you just put a coffee filter, rubber band it on there, and that'll be fine. If you are going to bake daily or very often, you can just leave this on your counter and you feed it every day. If you're only going to bake once a week like I do, I put this in the refrigerator and feed it the day before I'm going to use it. So I'll get it out of the refrigerator, I'll let it come to room temperature, and I'll feed it. And that way the next day when I'm making my bread, I have enough starter to use. And then I don't have a lot of extra. So if I was a professional baker, or if I was home all the time and could do this every day and we would just eat a fresh loaf of bread every day, I would just leave this on my counter, feed it every day. But I work, I don't have time for that. So to feed your starter, you can either do by weight or by measuring. We are old school. Hopefully you have a much better kitchen scale than this, but we have a really old school kitchen scale, and this calls for 100 grams of warm water and 100 grams of flour. So I know my 100 grams of flour is about 2/3 of a cup. So, and I always use the same cup. because I know this cup is like about 2 ounces. And then, so really I put 102 on the scale. And then the water is about half a cup. So it's, you know, roughly the same weight as my flour, even though it's a little bit more. And then I just pour that in there and I stir it up. Give it a good stir so that your starter gets all mixed in and it gets its new food and it can grow. You want to get all the way down into the bottom to mix it all up. Now, if your jar gets really gross, like this jar is getting kind of gross, you can definitely pour this into a new jar, because as you can see, like around the edges here where it has oozed out, it's kind of dry and it's just a messy look. You know, if you're a lot neater and you don't want this messiness, put it in a clean jar. That is fine. Now, a starter looks like, it kind of looks like pancake dough, a little bit. I mean, it's really airy looking. It's got a lot of air bubbles in it. And after it eats this water and flour, it'll definitely look even more airy. And so it's a very moist and sticky dough, and it's air bubbly. And you can hear it when you stir it. You can hear the air bubbles in there. So that's feeding the starter. And like I said, you just put a coffee filter on top of it or something with that it can breathe through and let it sit. And then you have starter for your next loaf of bread. It's really, you know, I said I'm not super successful with sourdough, and I'm not. But it's not super complicated either. It's just time consuming. And I think I need to work on the proving part of it. That's what's giving me fits, is the proving. But the starter is kind of fun. A lot of people will name their starters. Like, you know, this could be Susie or Joyce or whoever I want it to be. And you just have to feed Joyce every day. I've heard stories about people who take their starters with them on vacation. So that they can feed them, or people who have house sitters come and feed their starters for them. So you can get as obsessed with your starter as you want, or you could be like me, stick it in the fridge, bring it out, feed it once a week, and then make your loaf of bread. We do enjoy homemade bread. I make a really good French bread, which I haven't made in a couple of months because I've been practicing sourdough, but that is much easier. Less time consuming, but sourdough is fun. So we will see how my loaf of bread proves and see if we can get a decent loaf of bread out of it. This is the one I made yesterday. And this is probably a lesson in what not to do. It looks okay. It's a little flat. It is fairly hard. This is a very dense loaf of bread. This is why I think this is a huge fail. I had this proved. This was my loaf that I had proved. It was this glorious mound of dough. It was my dad said it would be the best loaf of bread ever, and it would have been. But I took it out of my proving bowl and it went whoop, and it just flattened. And then I tried proving it again and it just never worked. So I think this is overproved and it's probably hard as a rock, but that's, you know, that's the problem with bread. You're not always successful. So, yeah, when your bread is ready to bake, if we ever get to this part, baking is kind of interesting too, because you want a steamy oven. So you put a pan of water in your oven so that it steams while your bread's baking. And you can even get a spray bottle of water and spray down the sides of your oven to create additional steam throughout the baking process. So that's interesting. When you cook this, you get your oven really hot. So you turn it on to 450 and get it super hot. You cook, if you're doing a round loaf like this, you cook it in a cast iron Dutch oven, or any deeper pan, I guess. But we do a cast iron, and use parchment paper so it doesn't stick to your cast iron. But you put your cast iron Dutch oven in the oven to heat up. And then once you're up to temperature, you very carefully remove it. Put your bread on the parchment paper in the Dutch oven, and then you bake it, or you turn your oven down to 425 and bake it for about 17 minutes. And then after that, you turn your oven down again to 350 and bake it another 30 to 35 minutes. So the different temperatures is a little different for baking bread. I know when I bake French bread, it's just a very hot oven and you want it to get hot, and then your bread gets nice and crusty and everything. But sourdough is a little different. And it does taste a little different. It does have a little bit of a twang. I wouldn't say this is super twangy, but it's definitely a little different than a French bread. So that is our starter and what a loaf of bread looks like. We're gonna let the one I have in the oven prove for a while, and then we'll see what happens with it. All right, so my dough has proved and we are ready to bake it. I have it on the parchment paper, and I have my oven on 450 degrees, my pan of water in there, and my cast iron skillet that I'm going to cook this in. So I'm very carefully getting it out, because it is very hot. It's 450 degrees. I'm going to very carefully put my bread in this hot pan. And then I am going to bake this at 425 degrees for 17 minutes. So I'm going to change my temperature to 425. And then we're going to bake that for 17 minutes. And then we're going to drop the temperature down to 350 for another half hour. So another 30, 35 minutes. You can, while you're baking this, get a little spray bottle of water and spray the insides of your oven to add some extra steam. The pan of water that I have in there will add the steam. So hopefully in about 47 minutes, we will have a lovely loaf of sourdough bread. Okay, so my loaf of bread is baked. I did forget one thing. With sourdough, you're supposed to score the top of it to let the steam out, and I did forget that. So please make sure when you are doing your loaf of bread, you score the top. You can just do a simple X. You can do a fancy design, however you want it. But my loaf of bread is done, and got a nice crusty edge on it. Let's see what it looks like in the middle here. Still very hot from the oven. I just took it out of the oven, literally. Ooh, did you see all that steam coming out of there? Mm-hmm. All right, so we have a lovely, lovely loaf of bread here. It's got a lot of nice little air bubbles in it. Let's see what it tastes like. Ooh, it is very hot. Let me grab my hot holder. That steam is making it very, very hot. So, you know, the crust is always the best part. Let's see how hot it is. Mmm, delicious. Has a lovely flavor. So, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of DIY Homesteading, where we made sourdough bread. I hope you make some bread of your own and enjoy it.